In the closing months of World War II, as the Third Reich crumbled and Hitler's empire collapsed into rubble and ash, Allied forces discovered something that would baffle military experts, defy scientific explanation, and spawn decades of conspiracy theories that persist to this very day. A mysterious metallic structure hidden deep within a mountain laboratory in Nazi-occupied Poland. A device so secretive that its very existence was erased from official records, so classified that governments would spend years denying it had ever been created, and so technologically advanced that historians are still arguing about what it actually was and what the Nazis were trying to accomplish. This is the story of the Nazi bell, one of the most intriguing, controversial, and downright bizarre artifacts of World War II. A story that takes us from the shadowy corridors of Nazi scientific ambition to the frozen mountains of Eastern Europe, from the laboratories of quantum physicists to the secret testimonies of prisoners who witnessed its creation, and from the desperate final days of the Third Reich to modern researchers still trying to unlock its secrets and understand whether the Nazis were on the verge of unlocking something that would have changed the course of human history entirely. The official story, the one that you'll find in most textbooks and mainstream historical accounts, is remarkably thin. The Nazi bell, allegedly called Die Glocke in German, was supposedly some kind of advanced propulsion device or weapons system that the Nazis were developing in a secret facility called Wenceslas Mine in what is now Lower Silesia, Poland. But according to declassified documents and eyewitness testimony, this mechanical monster was far more complex and far more terrifying than any conventional weapon. And before we dive into the evidence, the contradictions, and the wild theories that have emerged over the decades, we need to understand the context in which this device was created. A regime obsessed with technological supremacy, willing to stop at nothing to achieve it, and desperately searching for last-ditch wonder weapons that might save it from total annihilation. The Nazi regime, particularly in its final years, was consumed by what historians call the Wunderwaffe obsession. The idea that somewhere in the depths of their laboratories, German scientists could develop a miracle weapon so devastating, so revolutionary, that it would reverse the tide of war and ensure German victory. And this wasn't just wild fantasy or the desperate delusions of a dying regime, because Germany had actually produced revolutionary weapons technology throughout the war: the V-2 rocket, the jet-powered Me-262 fighter, advanced U-boat designs, and countless other innovations that were years ahead of the Allies' own programs. So when reliable sources began reporting that the Nazis were working on something even more advanced, even more secret, in a mountain fortress in Poland, Allied intelligence agencies took it seriously, very seriously indeed. The first documented evidence of the Nazi bell's existence comes from a declassified U.S. military intelligence report from 1945, shortly after the war in Europe ended. And this report was based on testimony from Igor Witkowski, a Polish journalist and historian who claimed to have access to eyewitness accounts from former Nazi technicians and scientists who had worked on the project. According to Witkowski's research, the bell was actually constructed and tested in this remote Polish facility, and the device was so secretive that even most Nazi officials didn't know about it, let alone understand what it did. The project was allegedly overseen by some of the Third Reich's most brilliant minds, including scientists from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which was Germany's premier research organization. And what makes this story so compelling, so historically intriguing, is that the basic facts seem to check out. Yes, the Nazis did have secret weapons programs. Yes, they did test advanced technologies in remote locations. And yes, there were facilities hidden deep in the Polish mountains, where extraordinary research was supposedly taking place. Now, here's where the story becomes truly strange. Because the descriptions of the Nazi bell don't match anything in conventional military history or weapons development. Multiple witnesses described a structure that was roughly metallic, bell-shaped, perhaps 30 feet tall or more, containing complex internal mechanisms that involved rotating components, and most bizarrely, witnesses reported that when the device was activated, extremely unusual phenomena occurred: electromagnetic disturbances, strange lights, radiation effects, and in some accounts, effects on organic matter that sound like something out of science fiction rather than a legitimate historical record. Some prisoners who allegedly worked on the project reported that experimental animals were exposed to the device's effects and that they suffered bizarre mutations, organ damage, and other horrifying consequences, creating what sounds like a nightmarish scenario straight from a Nazi horror film. And when you combine these eyewitness accounts with the mysterious disappearance of the device, the destruction of all official documentation, and the fact that the facility was apparently booby-trapped and destroyed as the Nazis retreated, you're left with a story that seems almost too strange to be true. And yet the evidence that something real happened in that Polish mountain is surprisingly compelling. The scientific and historical community has been deeply divided about the Nazi bell for decades, and there are essentially three major theories about what the device actually was. The first theory, promoted by some mainstream historians and skeptics, is that the Nazi bell was simply propaganda, that it either never existed at all or was a far more mundane device that has been mythologized and sensationalized over the years, that the wild stories about radiation effects and electromagnetic phenomena are exaggerations or outright fabrications, spread by unreliable witnesses or deliberate disinformation. And these skeptics point out that many of the accounts come from sources that are hard to verify, that declassified documents are frustratingly vague, and that some of the technological claims seem implausible even by the standards of Nazi Germany's advanced research programs. The second major theory is that the Nazi bell was indeed a real device, but it was something much more mundane than the spectacular claims suggest. Perhaps it was an advanced German research device for studying particle physics or nuclear reactions, or perhaps it was some kind of prototype propulsion system or radar technology. In this view, the Nazi bell was real, the facility was real, but the extraordinary claims about its capabilities and effects have been wildly exaggerated. And what witnesses actually saw was cutting-edge, but ultimately conventional 1940s technology being developed for military purposes. The third, and by far the most controversial theory, is that the Nazi bell was actually a real device that really did produce some of the extraordinary effects that witnesses described. And in this theory, the Nazis were working on something revolutionary, something that involved advanced understanding of physics and energy manipulation that may have been decades ahead of what the rest of the world was developing. And according to this view, the stories about radiation effects, electromagnetic phenomena, and other strange occurrences were essentially accurate. And when the Nazis realized that the war was lost, they destroyed the device and the records to ensure that neither the Soviets nor the Americans could capture this revolutionary technology and harness it for their own military purposes. To understand which of these theories might have merit, we need to examine the actual evidence in detail, starting with the physical testimony of Igor Witkowski, the Polish researcher whose work first brought widespread attention to the Nazi bell in the 1990s. Witkowski claimed to have interviewed multiple former Nazi scientists and technicians, including a man named Jakob Sporenberg, who allegedly had direct knowledge of the project. Witkowski's account describes the facility as a top-secret underground laboratory in the Wenceslas mine complex in Lower Silesia, a region of Poland that was part of Nazi-occupied territory during World War II. The facility was apparently so secret that it operated under extreme security, with limited access even for Nazi officers. And the project apparently had its own internal security apparatus to ensure that information about the device didn't leak to competing Nazi agencies or to Allied intelligence services. According to Witkowski's testimony, the bell was a massive cylindrical structure, mounted inside a larger bell-shaped metal container. The interior contained rotating cylinders, or drums, made of an unidentified material, possibly mercury or some other exotic substance, and the entire device was connected to an elaborate system of electrical transformers, wiring, and control apparatus. When activated, the device apparently drew enormous amounts of electrical power, far more than was typical for experimental equipment of that era. And this massive power consumption is one of the most intriguing details, because it suggests that whatever the device was doing, it was energy-intensive in a way that conventional military equipment wouldn't typically be. Multiple witnesses allegedly reported that when the device operated, they experienced strange sensations, saw unusual lights in the sky, and in some cases, suffered what they described as radiation sickness. One particularly disturbing account describes animals that were placed in the vicinity of the device during experiments, and these animals apparently suffered horrible internal injuries, mutations, and rapid death from what sounds like intense radiation exposure. If these accounts are even partially accurate, then whatever the device was doing, it was generating something far more dangerous than conventional electrical or mechanical energy. It was producing radiation of some kind, possibly ionizing radiation that could damage living tissue at the cellular level. Now, let's turn to what declassified government documents actually say about the Nazi bell. And this is where things get genuinely interesting from a historical perspective. Because the American government definitely knew about the project, in fact. Shortly after the war ended, U.S. intelligence agencies launched something called Operation Paperclip, a massive effort to capture Nazi scientists, Nazi documentation, and Nazi technology before the Soviets could get to them. And in the context of Operation Paperclip, American military intelligence was absolutely focused on finding evidence of Nazi secret weapons projects and capturing the scientists who worked on them. During this period, American intelligence officers conducted debriefings with captured Nazi scientists and technicians, and some of these debriefings apparently included discussions of the bell, in fact. Several declassified documents from the CIA and Army intelligence mention a secret Nazi weapons project in Poland that matches the description of the bell, though the documents themselves are remarkably vague and heavily redacted. What's particularly interesting is how the American government treated information about the bell once they obtained it. They apparently didn't dismiss it out of hand as ridiculous science fiction. Instead, they treated it as a serious enough matter to warrant investigation and continued intelligence gathering. American intelligence officers were dispatched to Eastern Europe and later to the Soviet Union, with instructions to gather information about whether the Soviets had captured the device or any documentation about it. This level of official interest in something that mainstream historians would later dismiss as mere mythology suggests that American officials, at least in the immediate post-war period, took the existence of the Nazi bell seriously, and the declassified documents show that American scientists and military officials were concerned enough about the possibility of Nazi advanced technology to devote significant resources to tracking it down. The Soviet perspective on the Nazi bell is equally intriguing, because after World War II, the Soviet Union also went on a massive hunt for Nazi technology and Nazi scientists, and the Soviets were apparently very interested in locating the Wenceslas mine facility and determining what the Nazis had been developing there. Soviet records, many of which weren't declassified until the 1990s, show that Soviet intelligence officers found evidence that something genuinely unusual had been developed at the facility. Though the Soviets apparently never located the device itself, some historians and researchers believe that the Soviets may have actually located remnants of the device, or parts of it, and incorporated what they learned into Soviet advanced weapons research programs, particularly in the field of high-energy physics and plasma physics, which became major focuses of Soviet military research during the Cold War. One of the most intriguing pieces of physical evidence in the Nazi Bell mystery is what happened to the actual facility. The Wenceslas mine was apparently booby-trapped by Nazi engineers as the Red Army closed in, and when Soviet forces moved into the area, they reported finding that the main underground complex had been demolished, either by explosives set by Nazi engineers or by the German military as they retreated. The complete destruction of the facility, along with the apparent destruction of all documentation about the project, suggests that Nazi leadership considered the Bell important enough to destroy, rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. This is consistent with the testimony of various witnesses who claimed that Nazi officials deliberately destroyed evidence of the project as the war ended, knowing that if the Americans or Soviets captured the technology and the documentation, it could radically shift the balance of power in the emerging Cold War. Now, let's examine some of the specific claims about what the Nazi Bell actually was and what it could allegedly do. And this is where we move from documented history into the realm of speculation and theory, because there are essentially three main hypotheses about the Bell's function. The first is that it was a prototype nuclear reactor, or nuclear weapon, developed by German scientists who were further along in nuclear weapons development than most people realize. The second is that it was an advanced propulsion device, possibly related to so-called anti-gravity theories, or exotic physics that the Nazis were supposedly exploring. And the third is that it was a high-energy weapon designed to produce some kind of radiation or energy weapon effect. The nuclear hypothesis is actually quite compelling when you examine it carefully, because contrary to popular belief, Nazi Germany did have a significant nuclear research program, though it lagged behind the American Manhattan Project. German scientists understood nuclear fission and the basic principles of nuclear weapons, and there is considerable evidence that Nazi leaders were interested in developing atomic weapons. What if the Nazi Bell was actually a prototype reactor or weapons assembly that the Nazis were developing in secret, hidden from even many of the Nazi leadership? Such a device would explain why it was kept under such extreme security, why it consumed such enormous amounts of electrical power, why witnesses reported radiation effects, and why the Nazis would destroy it rather than allow it to fall into Allied hands. The propulsion hypothesis is more speculative, but it's based on the testimony of certain witnesses who described the Bell as having extraordinary aeronautical properties. Some accounts describe the Bell as being developed as a prototype for a revolutionary aircraft or spacecraft that would utilize exotic physics or exotic propulsion systems. And some researchers have speculated that Nazi scientists may have been exploring concepts related to what modern physicists would call plasma physics, electromagnetic propulsion, or other exotic physics concepts. If this hypothesis is true, then the Nazi Bell represents an attempt by Nazi engineers to develop something years or even decades ahead of its time. A propulsion system based on principles that wouldn't be seriously explored again until decades later. The weapons hypothesis suggests that the Bell was developed as an extremely high-energy weapon, possibly capable of producing radiation, electromagnetic pulses, or other devastating effects. Such a weapon would have been revolutionary in 1945, far ahead of anything the Allies had developed. And it could have theoretically been deployed as a terror weapon or as a way to devastate military installations. Some researchers have speculated that the Bell was a kind of high-energy radiation emitter that could produce ionizing radiation over large areas, causing widespread biological damage and illness. Of all these hypotheses, the one that seems to have the most evidential support is the nuclear reactor hypothesis, because we know for certain that Nazi Germany did have a nuclear research program. We know that Nazi scientists understood nuclear fission. We know that Nazi leadership wanted atomic weapons. And we know that the Germans were willing to hide advanced weapons projects in remote mountain facilities where they could work in secret. A prototype reactor or weapons assembly would explain virtually all of the documented characteristics of the Bell: the massive power consumption, the radiation effects reported by witnesses, the secrecy, the destruction of the facility, and the intense interest shown by American and Soviet intelligence agencies after the war. However, we must be cautious about reaching definitive conclusions, because the historical record on the Nazi Bell is frustratingly incomplete. Many of the key documents have been lost or destroyed. Many of the key witnesses have passed away, and what remains is a mixture of declassified government documents, eyewitness testimony from unreliable sources, and speculation by researchers with varying degrees of credibility. What we can say with confidence is that something happened in that Polish mountain facility, that Nazi leadership considered it important enough to build in absolute secrecy, to guard with extreme security, and to destroy rather than allow to fall into enemy hands. What that something was precisely, and what it could actually do, remains one of the great unanswered questions of World War II history. The discovery of the Nazi Bell by Allied forces in 1945 was not a dramatic moment captured in photographs or recorded in detailed official reports. Instead, it was a confused, chaotic affair in the final weeks of the war in Europe, when American and Soviet forces were rapidly advancing into Nazi-held territory. German forces were in retreat, and information was fragmentary and unreliable. According to various accounts, American forces reached the Wenceslas mine area before the Soviets, but when they arrived, they found that the facility had been destroyed or sealed, and the device itself appeared to be gone. Whether the device had been moved by Nazi engineers, destroyed on site, or captured by someone else remains unclear. What is clear is that no intact Nazi Bell was ever captured by the Allies or displayed as a war trophy, which is perhaps the single most important fact in the entire story. Because if the Nazis had actually developed a functioning advanced weapon or revolutionary device, you would expect it to have been captured, studied, and eventually documented by Allied intelligence agencies. The fact that no such device was ever found, and that what documentation exists is fragmentary and contradictory, is the biggest argument against the Nazi Bell being a fully functional, genuinely revolutionary device. After the war, the fate of the Nazi Bell became wrapped up in Cold War espionage and intelligence operations. American intelligence agencies, particularly the new CIA, which was founded in 1947, were intensely interested in any evidence that the Nazis had been developing advanced weapons or propulsion systems, because the emerging Soviet threat meant that any technological advantage might be crucial. If the Nazis had developed something revolutionary, and if the Soviets had found it first, or were developing something based on captured Nazi research, that would be a catastrophic national security threat. This Cold War paranoia may have contributed to the classification and secrecy that surrounded information about the Nazi Bell, making it even harder to determine what actually happened and what was real. Throughout the Cold War, scattered claims emerged from various sources about the Nazi Bell. Some former Nazi scientists, who had been captured by the Russians and brought to the Soviet Union, claimed in their later testimonies that they had worked on such a device. Some post-war researchers and historians who interviewed former Nazi technicians claimed to have obtained detailed descriptions of the device. But as time went on, and as many of the key witnesses died, and as the Cold War itself gradually faded, it became increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction, from deliberate disinformation, from simple human error and misremembering by the 1990s. The Nazi Bell had become a staple of conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, and alternative history literature, with wild claims about its capabilities ranging from the merely speculative to the completely fantastic. The modern resurgence of interest in the Nazi Bell came in the 1990s with the publication of Igor Witkowski's book, The Truth About the Wunderwaffe, which brought extensive testimony from claimed witnesses and insiders. Witkowski's work was meticulously researched and carefully documented, and it sparked renewed interest among serious historians and researchers. Witkowski claimed that the device was a technology demonstrator for revolutionary propulsion or weapons technology, and that Nazi leadership was so desperate to keep it secret that they destroyed all evidence when the war was lost. Witkowski's work has been influential in keeping the Nazi bell in the public consciousness and in encouraging continued research and speculation about what the device might have been. In recent years, several researchers have attempted to conduct more rigorous historical investigations into the Nazi bell, examining declassified documents, interviewing remaining witnesses or their descendants, and trying to separate documented fact from speculation and myth. What these researchers have discovered is that while something definitely happened at the Wenceslas mine facility, and while Nazi leadership definitely considered it important enough to keep secret and to destroy, the historical record is simply too fragmentary to allow us to reach definitive conclusions about what the device was or what it could do. The technological and scientific aspects of the Nazi bell story are equally intriguing, because if we take seriously some of the claims about what the device could do, we're talking about technologies that were decades ahead of what conventional physics in 1945 would have suggested was possible. For instance, some accounts describe effects that sound like plasma physics or electromagnetic phenomena, which weren't really developed as scientific disciplines until decades after World War II. This leads to a fascinating question. Did Nazi scientists have access to theoretical knowledge or experimental data that has since been lost, or do these accounts reflect a mixing of modern scientific understanding with historical events, creating a false impression that the Nazis were farther ahead than they actually were? Some researchers have suggested that Nazi scientists may have had access to certain theoretical physics insights, perhaps from quantum mechanics or from other exotic physics concepts that they were attempting to apply in practical ways. If this is true, then the Nazi bell might represent one of the first attempts to weaponize exotic physics or advanced theoretical concepts, an idea that is fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The destruction of the Nazi bell, if it was indeed a functional device, represents one of the great lost opportunities in the history of science and technology. Because if the device was indeed based on revolutionary principles or exotic physics, then the loss of the device and the documentation meant that the world lost the chance to understand and develop whatever principles the Nazis had discovered. This is actually somewhat tragic from a historical perspective, because any technology that could have advanced human knowledge or capabilities was lost forever. We can only speculate about what might have been if the device and its documentation had survived intact and had been captured by scientists who could have understood and built upon the Nazi research. The conspiracy theories that have grown up around the Nazi bell are numerous and varied, and range from the plausible to the completely ridiculous. Some theorists claim that the Nazi bell was actually captured by the Americans and hidden away in secret military facilities, where it continues to be studied in classified research programs. Others claim that the Soviets captured it and used it as the basis for their own advanced weapons programs. Some truly wild theories claim that the Nazi bell was actually an alien technology that fell into Nazi hands, or that it was based on knowledge obtained from contact with extraterrestrials. While these extreme theories have essentially no credible evidence to support them, they do reflect a genuine fascination with the idea that the Nazis might have been on the verge of developing something revolutionary, and that this technology was lost to history when the Third Reich fell. What we can say about the conspiracy theories is that they demonstrate how powerful the Nazi bell story is as a cultural artifact, how compelling the mystery of the device is to popular imagination, and how desperately people want to believe that there is some hidden secret from World War II that explains some aspect of modern history or technology. The Nazi bell has become a kind of cultural blank slate on which different people project their own theories, fears, and hopes about advanced technology and secret military research. From a strictly historical perspective, the most honest conclusion that we can reach about the Nazi bell is this: something unusual happened at the Wenceslas mine facility in Poland. Nazi leadership considered it important enough to keep secret, to guard with extreme security, and to destroy rather than allow to fall into enemy hands. Multiple witnesses reported unusual phenomena associated with the device, and both American and Soviet intelligence agencies took the matter seriously enough to devote resources to investigating it. However, the historical record is too fragmentary to determine with certainty what the device actually was, what it could do, or whether it was actually a genuinely revolutionary technology or a more conventional weapons system that has been mythologized over time. The loss of physical evidence, the destruction of documentation, the passage of decades, and the death of key witnesses have made it essentially impossible to reach definitive conclusions. And so the Nazi bell remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of World War II, a tantalizing historical question that continues to fascinate researchers, inspire conspiracy theories, and challenge our understanding of what Nazi Germany was capable of achieving in the closing years of the war. The lessons of the Nazi bell story are multiple and profound. First, it reminds us that totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany were indeed willing and able to develop revolutionary technologies in secret, and that advanced weapons research can remain hidden from public view. Second, it demonstrates how difficult it is to reconstruct history when key evidence is destroyed, when witnesses are unreliable or deceased, and when governments classify information for decades. Third, it shows how a genuine historical mystery can become distorted by conspiracy theories and speculation, and how difficult it is to separate fact from fiction when dealing with incomplete historical records. And finally, it reminds us that history is not always neat and tidy, that important events sometimes leave no clear documentary evidence, and that some questions about the past may remain unanswered forever. The Nazi bell is a fascinating historical puzzle, a tantalizing reminder that there may be aspects of World War II history that remain unknown or poorly understood, and a powerful symbol of how advanced technology can be hidden, destroyed, or lost to history in ways that we may never fully understand or recover from. Whether the Nazi bell was a revolutionary weapons system, an advanced reactor, a propulsion device, or something else entirely, remains one of the enduring mysteries of the 20th century, a question that historians and researchers continue to investigate, debate, and speculate about, and a story that captures our imagination precisely because it remains unresolved, precisely because it challenges our historical understanding, and precisely because it suggests that there may be chapters of World War II history that are still waiting to be discovered, still waiting to be understood, and still capable of revealing truths that could reshape our understanding of what happened during humanity's darkest and most technologically dynamic era.